So, if you look at the 90s console wars, you usually think of Nintendo versus Sega, right? Sonic versus Mario, Sega does what Nintendo don't, all of that. But the craziest part of that entire era is that Nintendo accidentally ended up creating their own worst enemy. The Sony PlayStation only exists because Nintendo chose to brutally, publicly humiliate Sony on a random morning in 1991. To understand how insane this is, you have to picture the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. It's June 1991. Sony takes the stage, and they proudly announce to the world that they've partnered with Nintendo. They're building a brand new console extension, a CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo. It was going to be called the PlayStation, spelled with a space back then. Sony's lead engineer, a guy named Ken Kutaragi, had spent years working on this. It was his baby. Sony was officially entering the gaming market hand in hand with the biggest name in the world. The crowd went wild, and then, the very next morning, Nintendo took the stage for their own presentation. Instead of coming out and hyping up the Sony partnership, Nintendo's executive stands up and basically tells the world, yeah, never mind, we're partnering with Philips instead. Sony's executives were literally sitting in the audience. They found out they were dumped at the exact same time as the journalists. It was an absolute corporate execution, completely cold-blooded. Now, to understand why Nintendo did this, why pull the plug at the absolute last second, it all came down to a legal loophole and a massive dose of corporate paranoia. See, Ken Kutaragi was a brilliant engineer, but he was also a ruthless businessman. When he wrote up the original contract between Sony and Nintendo, he slipped in a clause that said Sony would completely control of the proprietary CD-ROM format, and they'd keep the licensing rights for any games made on it. Nintendo's president at the time was Hiroshi Yamauchi. The guy was a legend, but he was also famously terrifying and fiercely protective of Nintendo. He realized a little too late what that contract actually meant. Nintendo was basically handing Sony the keys to the kingdom. In Yamauchi's eyes, Sony wasn't just helping them build an add-on, they were using Nintendo to Trojan horse their way into the software market. But instead of picking up the phone and renegotiating like a human being, Yamauchi secretly sent his executives to Europe to strike a back-alley deal with Philips behind Sony's back. The wildest part of this whole thing is that the physical prototypes of that original Nintendo PlayStation actually exist. A couple of years ago, a real dual-branded prototype, it literally has a Sony logo and a Super Nintendo controller slot on the same piece of plastic, surfaced and sold at an auction for like $360,000. It's basically the holy grail of gaming history. So what happens when you publicly humiliate a multi-billion-dollar tech giant? Well, if you're Sony, you don't just pack up your bags and go home. You get mad. And if initially, Sony's board of directors wanted to pull out of gaming completely. They thought video games were just a passing fad anyway, and the embarrassment of the Nintendo situation was too much to bear. But Ken Kutaragi stood up in front of the CEO of Sony and basically asked him, are we really just going to take this lying down? He convinced the CEO to let him take that exact CD-ROM technology, ditch the Nintendo partnership completely, and build a standalone 3D-focused powerhouse. And this backfired on Nintendo catastrophically. Because Nintendo was so traumatized by the Sony situation, they got terrified of CDs. They decided to stick with cartridges for the Nintendo 64. But cartridges were expensive to make and barely had any storage space. Because of that, third-party developers started abandoning Nintendo in droves. Square took Final Fantasy VII, a game that was originally meant for Nintendo, and gave it to Sony. because they needed the space of a CD. Nintendo tried so hard to crush a potential rival before it could start, but their own paranoia ended up creating the absolute biggest juggernaut in gaming history. If Nintendo hadn't stabbed Sony in the back that morning in Chicago, the PlayStation brand as we know it today would literally not exist.